David Rodriguez had always believed he was destined for greatness. At 24, he was already performing in some of the most beautiful concert halls across Europe. His fingers moved across piano keys like magic, creating sounds that made audiences hold their breath in wonder. But somewhere along the way, success had changed him. He wasn't the same humble boy who had started playing piano at age 5 in his grandmother's small apartment. Back then, music was pure joy for him. He would spend hours at the old upright piano, completely lost in the melodies he created. His grandmother would sit nearby, knitting and smiling as she listened to her grandson pour his heart into the music. Those days felt like a lifetime ago. Now, David lived in a world of expensive suits, 5-star hotels, and constant praise. Everyone around him told him he was exceptional, that he was a gift to the classical music world. Slowly, these words had inflated his ego until he began to believe he was better than everyone else. The concert halls where he performed were always packed. People would travel from different cities just to hear him play. Music critics wrote glowing reviews calling him a technical master and the future of classical piano. With each standing ovation, with each perfect review, David's sense of superiority grew stronger. He had developed a habit of looking down on other musicians. During rehearsals, he would roll his eyes when other performers made mistakes. He would make cutting remarks about their technique, their interpretation, their lack of natural talent. The orchestra members had learned to stay away from him during breaks. They found him cold and arrogant. David's manager, Robert, had tried to talk to him about his attitude several times. "You're incredibly talented," Robert would say, "but talent alone isn't everything. People are starting to talk about your behavior." David would just shrug these conversations off. In his mind, jealousy was natural when you were as gifted as he was. Tonight was different, though. Tonight, he wasn't performing at his usual venues filled with wealthy classical music lovers. Instead, he was at a charity event for the National Foundation for the Blind. The venue was elegant enough. A beautiful historic theater with red velvet seats and golden decorations on the walls. But David felt this was beneath him. He had only agreed to perform because his publicist insisted it would be good for his image. "It shows your charitable side," she had explained. "The media will love it." David didn't care about charity or helping others. He just wanted to get through the evening and collect his fee. As he warmed up backstage, David could hear the audience gathering in the theater. The sound was different from his usual concerts. Instead of the sophisticated murmur of his typical audience, he heard a mix of voices, some older, some younger, some speaking in different languages. Many were being guided to their seats by volunteers or family members. "This is ridiculous," David muttered to himself as he adjusted his bow tie in the mirror. "I'm performing Rachmaninoff for people who can't even see my technique. What's the point?" A young volunteer knocked on his dressing room door. "Mr. Rodriguez? We're ready for your sound check." David walked onto the stage and looked out at the partially filled theater. Many of the audience members were already in their seats, and he noticed something that made him uncomfortable. A significant number of them had white canes beside their chairs or guide dogs lying quietly at their feet. Some were wearing dark glasses even though they were indoors. "I can't believe I'm wasting my talent on this crowd," he thought to himself, as he sat at the grand piano. It was a beautiful instrument, a Steinway concert grand that had been donated specifically for the event. Under normal circumstances, David would have been excited to play such a magnificent piano. Tonight it just felt like pearls before swine. During the sound check, David played a few scales and arpeggios. His technique was flawless as always, his fingers flying across the keys with precision, but his heart wasn't in it. He was already thinking about the expensive restaurant where he planned to have dinner after the show. The event coordinator, a cheerful woman in her 50s, approached the stage. "Mr. Rodriguez, thank you so much for being here tonight. This means the world to our community." David gave her a polite but cold smile. "Of course, when do I perform?" "You're our featured artist, so you'll close the show. We have a few other performers first, some of our students from the music program." David's eyebrows shot up. "Students? You mean amateur performers?" Well, they're learning, but some of them are quite talented. Music is incredibly important to the blind community. Many of our members have developed extraordinary musical abilities. David almost laughed out loud. I'm sure they have, he said. With barely concealed sarcasm. As the evening began, David watched from the wings as various performers took the stage. There was an elderly man who played violin, his fingers finding each note by touch and memory. A teenage boy sang an operatic piece with surprising vocal control. A middle-aged woman played flute with gentle, flowing phrases. To David, it all sounded amateur. Sure, they were competent, but they lacked the technical perfection he had spent years developing. They played with feeling, but feeling without technique was worthless in his opinion. He checked his watch repeatedly, waiting for his turn to show everyone what real music sounded like. The audience seemed to enjoy these performances, clapping enthusiastically after each piece. David found their appreciation annoying. They're applauding mediocrity, he thought. They wouldn't know real talent if it hit them in the face. During intermission, David overheard conversations in the lobby. People were discussing the music with genuine passion and knowledge. One older gentleman was explaining to his companion the subtle differences between various interpretations of a Beethoven sonata. A young woman was describing how music helped her navigate the world in ways that sight never could, despite himself. David was surprised by their sophisticated understanding of music, but he quickly pushed these thoughts away. Book knowledge doesn't equal real ability, he told himself. As the second half of the program began, David prepared for his performance. He had chosen to play Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, one of the most technically demanding pieces in the classical repertoire. It was a piece that showcased every aspect of his technical abilities: speed, power, delicacy, and complex musical architecture. He knew this piece would be impossible for any of the amateur performers he had watched earlier. It required years of intensive training, perfect finger independence, and an understanding of musical structure that only came from formal conservatory education. Standing in the wings, adjusting his cufflinks one final time, David felt confident. Soon, everyone in this theater would understand the difference between real artistry and the well-meaning but limited attempts they had been hearing all evening. He had no idea that his entire worldview was about to be shattered by what would happen next. The evening was about to take a turn that would change not just his opinion of others, but his understanding of what music really meant. The intermission was almost over when David noticed her. She was being guided through the theater lobby by a volunteer, her white cane folded neatly in her free hand. The young woman appeared to be in her early 20s, with long dark hair that fell in gentle waves over her shoulders. She moved with quiet confidence, her head tilted slightly as she listened to the sounds around her. David watched from the backstage entrance as she made her way through the crowd. What struck him wasn't her blindness. He had seen many blind people in the audience that evening. It was something else entirely. Despite being unable to see, she seemed to navigate the social atmosphere with an ease that many sighted people lacked. She smiled warmly at voices she recognized, nodded politely to introductions, and engaged in conversations with genuine interest. "That's Isabella," said Robert, David's manager, who had appeared beside him. "She's quite remarkable, actually. Been coming to these events for years." David barely acknowledged the comment. He was more interested in getting back to his dressing room to prepare for his performance. But as he turned to leave, he overheard a conversation that made him stop in his tracks. The event coordinator was speaking with Isabella near the refreshment table. "We're so glad you could make it tonight, dear. The performance has been wonderful so far." "It really has," Isabella replied, her voice carrying a warmth that seemed genuine. The violinist in the first half had such beautiful tone. And that young tenor, his breath control has improved so much since last year. David frowned. How could she possibly judge breath control or tone quality? These were technical aspects that required trained ears and years of musical education. Yet she spoke about them with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was talking about. "I hope you'll consider performing again this year," the coordinator continued. Everyone always looks forward to hearing you play. David's attention sharpened. She was a performer too? He had assumed she was just another audience member, someone's daughter or sister who had been brought along to the charity event. The idea that she might actually play an instrument seemed almost amusing to him. "Oh, I don't know," Isabella said modestly. "There are so many talented musicians here tonight. I wouldn't want to take time away from them." "Nonsense," said another voice, an elderly man whom David recognized as one of the board members. "Your performance last year was absolutely stunning." "I still get chills thinking about it." David rolled his eyes. These people were probably being kind to her because of her condition. It was typical charity event behavior, everyone pretending. That amateur performances were magnificent to make the participants feel good about themselves. As the audience began filing back into the theater for the second half, David found himself watching Isabella again. She was being guided to a seat in the front row, right in the center. The volunteer helped her get settled, making sure her program was within reach, though David wondered why she would need a program she couldn't read. "Front row seat," David muttered to himself. "Probably a donor or something." Back in his dressing room, David went through his pre-performance routine. He stretched his fingers, did some technical exercises, and ran through the most difficult passages of the Chopin. Peace in his mind. He had performed this ballade hundreds of times, and it never failed to impress audiences. Tonight would be no different. A soft knock on his door interrupted his preparation. "Mr. Rodriguez?" "5 minutes until your performance." As David made his way to the stage entrance, he could hear the event coordinator addressing the audience. "Ladies and gentlemen, before we present our featured artist this evening, we'd like to invite any of our community members who would like to share their musical gifts to come forward." David paused. This wasn't in the program he had been given. Nobody had mentioned open performances during the second half. "We have a beautiful piano on stage," the coordinator continued, "and we know there are many talented musicians in our audience tonight." David felt a surge of irritation. He was about to perform one of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire, and now they were going to have amateur hour right before his performance. It would make his artistry look even more impressive by comparison, but it would also delay his performance and potentially tire out the audience. From his position in the wings, he could see the theater. Several hands had gone up in response to the coordinator's invitation. David shook his head in disbelief. These people had no sense of appropriate venue or timing. An older woman went first, playing a simple batch invention on the piano. Her technique was clean but basic, the kind of playing you might hear at a church service or community center. The audience applauded warmly when she finished. Next, a middle-aged man played a jazz standard, his interpretation loose and improvisational. David had to admit the man had some musical sense, but his classical technique was non-existent. Still, the audience seemed to enjoy it. Then something unexpected happened. From the front row, David saw Isabella raise her hand. The coordinator's face lit up. "Isabella, wonderful. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a very special treat for you." David watched as Isabella made her way to the stage, guided by the coordinator. She moved carefully but confidently, her hand trailing along the edge of the stage, until she found the steps. The audience had grown noticeably quieter, and David could sense an anticipation that hadn't been there for the previous performers. "This should be interesting," David whispered to a stagehand standing nearby. "I wonder if she can even find middle C." The stagehand looked at him with surprise, but David didn't notice. He was too busy watching Isabella as she approached the piano bench. She sat down carefully, her hands hovering over the keys for a moment. As she oriented herself to the instrument, the theater had become completely silent. David could hear his own breathing, the subtle creaking of the old building, the distant hum of the ventilation system. The audience seemed to be holding its collective breath. Isabella's fingers touched the keys gently, finding her starting position. David crossed his arms, expecting to witness a musical disaster that would make his upcoming performance look even more impressive by comparison. She began to play. The first notes that emerged from the piano made David's smug expression falter. This wasn't the simple melody or basic exercise he had expected. The opening phrase was complex, sophisticated, and executed with a precision that made him pay attention. As she continued, David realized with growing shock that Isabella was playing Chopin's Ballade No. 1 in G minor, the exact same piece he had planned to perform. But that wasn't the most surprising part. She was playing it beautifully. David felt his confidence begin to crack as he listened to her interpretation. This wasn't amateur playing. This was the work of someone who understood the music deeply. Someone who had spent years mastering not just the technical aspects but the emotional core of the piece. The audience remained perfectly still, completely absorbed in the performance. David found himself leaning forward, his earlier mockery forgotten, as he realized he was witnessing something he hadn't expected. For the first time in years, David Rodriguez was learning that his assumptions about people might be completely wrong. David's world tilted on its axis as Isabella's fingers moved across the piano keys with impossible grace. The opening measures of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the theater, but this wasn't the mechanical reproduction he had expected from an amateur. Each note seemed to breathe with life, carrying emotions that David had never been able to capture in his own performances of the same piece. He stood frozen in the wings, his mouth slightly open in disbelief. This was his signature piece, the composition he had spent years perfecting, the one that critics always praised in their reviews. Yet listening to Isabella play it, David felt like he was hearing it for the first time. Her technique was flawless, but that wasn't what shocked him most. It was her interpretation. Where David played the notes with precision and power, Isabella played them with vulnerability and truth. Every phrase seemed to tell a story, every dynamic change revealed another layer of meaning. The theater audience was completely captivated. David could see their faces from his position backstage, expressions of wonder, some with tears already forming in their eyes. In all his years of performing, he had never seen an audience so completely absorbed in a musical performance. How is this possible? David whispered to himself, his earlier arrogance crumbling with each passing measure. As Isabella moved into the first development section, David realized something that made his stomach drop. Not only was she playing his piece, she was playing it better than he ever had. The technical passages that he executed with mechanical precision flowed from her fingers like water, natural and effortless. But more than that, she was telling the story that Chopin had embedded in the music, the story that David had never fully understood, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. This wasn't supposed to happen. He was the trained professional, the conservatory graduate, the internationally recognized artist. She was just... He paused, realizing he didn't actually know anything about her except that she was blind. And sitting in his audience, the stagehand next to him was also mesmerized by the performance. "She's incredible," he whispered. "I've never heard anything like this." David wanted to argue, to point out technical flaws or interpretive mistakes, but he couldn't find any. Isabella's performance was not just technically perfect. It was musically honest in a way that made his own playing seem shallow by comparison. As she approached the climactic section of the ballade, the most technically demanding part of the piece, David held his breath. This was where amateur players always fell apart. The rapid octaves, the complex polyrhythms, the need to maintain musical line while executing incredibly difficult passages. This was where her performance would finally reveal its limitations, but Isabella sailed through the section with breathtaking ease. Her left hand thundered through the bass octaves while her right hand sang the melody with crystalline clarity. The balance between power and delicacy was perfect, something David had struggled with for years. Despite his technical training, the audience was completely silent except for the music. David could hear people holding their breath during the most intense passages, then sighing with relief and wonder as Isabella resolved each musical tension with perfect timing and emotional intelligence. "Who is she?" David found himself asking the stagehand. "Isabella Shun," the stagehand replied without taking his eyes off the performance. "She's been part of this community for years. Lost her sight in a car accident when she was 12, but she's been playing piano since she was 4. David's heart sank further. She had been playing longer than he had, and with a dedication born from necessity rather than ambition. While he had been using his musical ability to build his ego and career, she had been using hers to navigate a world that had suddenly become dark. As Isabella moved into the final section of the ballade, David realized something that terrified him. When she finished, he would still have to perform. The coordinator had introduced him as the evening's featured artist, and he couldn't simply disappear. But how could he follow this performance? How could he play the same piece after what the audience had just experienced? He thought about changing his program, playing something else instead. But it was too late. His music was already on the piano, the program had been printed, and the audience was expecting to hear from their featured performer. Isabella's performance was building toward its conclusion, the final dramatic passages that would bring Chopin's emotional journey to its powerful close. David watched her face as she played these final measures. There was no strain, no sense that she was pushing herself to execute difficult techniques. Instead, there was a kind of peaceful intensity, as if she and the music had become one entity. The last notes rang out in the theater, hanging in the air for what seemed like an eternity. The silence that followed was complete and profound. David had experienced many standing ovations in his career, but he had never experienced silence like this. The kind of silence that comes when an audience has been touched so deeply that applause feels inadequate. Finally, someone began to clap. Then another person joined in, and another, until the entire theater erupted in the most genuine, heartfelt applause David had ever heard. People weren't just clapping. They were on their feet, many of them crying, all of them transformed by what they had just experienced. Isabella stood and bowed gracefully, her face showing a mixture of humility and quiet joy. She had shared something precious with this audience, and they had received it with open hearts. As the applause continued, David felt something he hadn't experienced in years: genuine humility. His entire understanding of music, of talent, and of what it meant to be an artist was being rewritten in real time. The coordinator returned to the stage to escort Isabella back to her seat. "Ladies and gentlemen," she said into the microphone, "wasn't that absolutely extraordinary?" The applause intensified, and David could see that some audience members were wiping away tears. Isabella had not just played a piece of music. She had created a moment of pure human connection that transcended the boundaries between performer and audience. As Isabella made her way back to her seat, guided by the coordinator, David realized that his carefully planned performance had just become irrelevant. Not because the audience wouldn't appreciate it, but because he suddenly understood that everything he knew about music was wrong. He had spent years building a career on technical perfection and professional achievement. Isabella had just shown him what music could be when it came from the soul instead of the ego, standing in the wings. David Rodriguez faced a choice that would define the rest of his life. He could go out there and perform his version of the same piece, relying on his technical training and professional polish to impress the audience. Or he could finally admit that he had been missing the most important part of music all along. The coordinator was walking toward him now, ready to introduce him as the evening's featured artist. David's hands were shaking, not from nervousness about performing, but from the realization that everything he had built his identity around had just been revealed as incomplete. For the first time in his professional career, David Rodriguez was about to face an audience not as a superior artist, condescending to entertain them, but as a student who had just learned how much he still had to discover about the true power of music. The coordinator was walking toward David with a bright smile, ready to introduce him to the audience. His legs felt like they were made of lead. Behind him, he could still hear the excited whispers of the audience discussing Isabella's performance. Words like breathtaking, incredible, and life-changing floated through the air. "Mr. Rodriguez, you're on?" the coordinator whispered as she reached him. "What an evening this has been. The audience is going to love hearing you perform." David nodded weakly, his mouth too dry to speak. His hands, which had never trembled before a performance in his entire career, were shaking noticeably. He wiped his palms on his expensive suit pants, leaving damp patches on the fabric. The coordinator stepped onto the stage and approached the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, we now have the great honor of presenting our featured artist for this evening. Please welcome internationally acclaimed pianist David Rodriguez. The applause was warm and welcoming, but David could barely hear it over the pounding of his heart. He walked onto the stage on unsteady legs, his usual confident stride replaced by hesitant steps. The bright stage lights seemed harsher than usual, and he found himself squinting as he approached the piano. He sat down at the bench, the same bench where Isabella had just created magic. The piano keys looked different somehow, as if they held secrets he had never discovered. David placed his hands on the keyboard, feeling the smooth ivory beneath his fingers, looking out at the audience. He saw hundreds of faces looking back at him with expectation. In the front row, Isabella sat with her hands folded in her lap, her face turned toward the stage with an expression of gentle attention. Even though she couldn't see him, David felt like she was looking directly into his soul. For a moment, he considered announcing a different piece. He could play something safer, something that wouldn't invite direct comparison to what they had just heard. But his sheet music was already positioned on the piano, and changing now would only draw more attention to his sudden crisis of confidence. David took a deep breath and began to play. The opening notes of Chopin's Ballade No. 1 filled the theater. Once again, but this time something was different. David's usually flawless technique felt mechanical and cold. Each note he played seemed to echo Isabella's version. Highlighting everything that was missing from his own interpretation, he pushed through the first section, his fingers executing the familiar patterns with their usual precision, but precision wasn't enough anymore. The audience sat politely attentive, but David could sense their disappointment. After experiencing Isabella's emotionally rich performance, his technical perfection felt empty. As he moved into the development section, David's concentration began to waver. His mind kept replaying Isabella's version, remembering how she had shaped each phrase with such natural musicality. He tried to imitate her approach, but it felt forced and artificial coming from him. The audience was growing restless. David could hear subtle shifts in their breathing, the soft rustle of programs, the quiet creak of seats. These were the sounds of people who were being polite but not genuinely engaged. It was a performer's worst nightmare. Halfway through the piece, David made his first technical mistake. His left hand stumbled over a passage he had played perfectly thousands of times before. He recovered quickly, but the damage was done. His confidence, already shaken, crumbled further. The mistake seemed to break something inside him. Suddenly, all the arrogance and superiority he had built his career on felt like a house of cards collapsing. He wasn't the musical genius he had believed himself to be. He was just a skilled craftsman who had learned to play the notes without understanding their meaning. As he approached the climactic section that Isabella had handled with such grace, David felt panic rising in his chest. His breathing became shallow, and sweat began to bead on his forehead. The technical passages that had always been his specialty now felt like insurmountable obstacles. He stumbled again, this time more noticeably. Several people in the audience shifted uncomfortably in their seats. David could see confused expressions on faces throughout the theater. This wasn't the polished performance they had been expecting from their featured artist, but something strange began to happen. As David's technical perfection crumbled, something else started to emerge. For the first time in years, he wasn't thinking about impressing the audience or maintaining his reputation. He was just trying to survive the moment, to find some way to connect with the music that had always been his life. In his vulnerability, David began to hear the music differently. The notes weren't just technical exercises to be executed flawlessly. They were Chopin's own struggles and triumphs, his heartbreak and joy, his search for meaning in a world that often seemed hostile to artistic sensitivity. As this realization dawned on him, David's playing began to change. His technique was still imperfect, but there was something new in his interpretation. The notes began to carry emotional weight that they had never had before. He wasn't just playing the music anymore, he was feeling it. The audience sensed the change immediately. The restless energy in the theater shifted to focused attention. People leaned forward in their seats, drawn by the authenticity they were hearing. David's performance was no longer technically perfect, but it was becoming honest. In the front row, Isabella tilted her head slightly, her expression showing recognition of something she heard in his playing. For the first time, David was revealing something of himself through the music instead of hiding behind technical bravado. As he moved toward the final section of the ballade, David felt a profound sense of liberation. His career, his reputation, his carefully constructed image of superiority, none of it mattered anymore. All that mattered was the connection between his heart and the music, between his experience and Chopin's timeless expression of human emotion. The final passages flowed from his fingers with a combination of technical skill and emotional truth that he had never achieved before. The notes were still the same ones he had played hundreds of times, but they carried new meaning now. They spoke of humility learned, of arrogance abandoned, of a human being finally discovering what it meant to be truly vulnerable. As the last notes rang out in the theater, David sat motionless at the piano, emotionally drained but somehow renewed. The silence that followed was different from the one after Isabella's performance. It wasn't the awed silence of people who had witnessed perfection. It was the contemplative silence of people who had witnessed transformation. When the applause finally came, it was warm and genuine. The audience was applauding not just his performance, but his courage to be vulnerable, his willingness to let them see his humanity instead of his superiority. David stood and bowed, his eyes finding Isabella in the front row. She was applauding, with the same gentle smile she had worn throughout the evening, but there was something new in her expression, a recognition of a fellow traveler on the path toward musical truth. For the first time in his career, David Rodriguez had performed not as a master showing off his skills, but as a human being sharing his heart. The applause washing over him felt different from any he had received before. It was the sound of people who had been moved not by his technique, but by his humanity. As he walked off the stage, David knew that everything had changed. He could never go back to the arrogant, emotionally distant performer he had been. Isabella had shown him what music could be, and his own performance had shown him what he could become if he had the courage to keep growing. Backstage, David slumped into a chair in his dressing room, his head in his hands. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was fading, leaving behind a mixture of exhaustion and confusion. His expensive suit jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and his perfectly styled hair was now disheveled from running his fingers through it during the most challenging passages. He stared at his reflection in the mirror, hardly recognizing the person looking back at him. The confident, somewhat arrogant performer who had entered this theater a few hours ago seemed like a stranger. In his place sat someone who had been stripped down to his core, someone who had discovered that everything he thought he knew about himself was incomplete. A soft knock on the door interrupted his thoughts. "Come in," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Robert, his manager, entered the room with a concerned expression. "David, are you all right?" "That was different from your usual performances." David let out a bitter laugh. "Different? That's one way to put it. I completely fell apart out there, Robert. Did you see how I stumbled through those passages? My technique was a disaster." Robert sat down in the chair across from him. "Actually, that's not what I saw at." "Oh, yes, you made some technical mistakes, but something else happened out there." The audience was completely engaged. "I've been to hundreds of your concerts, and I've never seen people respond to your playing the way they did tonight." "They were probably just being polite," David said, shaking his head. "After hearing that blind girl play the same piece perfectly, my performance must have seemed like amateur hour." "Her name is Isabella," Robert said gently. "And yes, her performance was extraordinary. But David, you need to understand something. Your performance tonight was the first time I've ever seen you actually move an audience. Not impress them with your technique, but truly move them." David looked up at his manager with surprise. Robert had been with him for 5 years, through dozens of concerts and countless reviews. He had never spoken this directly before. "What do you mean?" David asked. "I mean that for the first time you played like a human being instead of a machine. Yes, you made mistakes, but you also made music. Real music that came from somewhere deep inside you. The audience felt that. Before David could respond, another knock came at the door. The event coordinator peeked in, her face glowing with excitement. Mr. Rodriguez, I hope you don't mind the interruption, but there are several people who would like to meet you. The response to your performance has been overwhelming, David frowned. People want to meet me? After that disaster? The coordinator looked genuinely confused. Disaster? Mr. Rodriguez, people are calling it one of the most moving performances they've ever heard. There's a line of people outside hoping to speak with you. David exchanged a bewildered look with Robert. This wasn't making any sense. In his mind, he had failed spectacularly. Yet everyone seemed to think the opposite. I suppose I could meet with a few people, David said hesitantly. The coordinator smiled brightly. Wonderful, I'll bring them in one at a time. The first person to enter was an elderly gentleman with kind eyes and a warm smile. He walked slowly, using a cane to guide his steps. Mr. Rodriguez, the man said, extending his hand. My name is Thomas Chen. I wanted to thank you for your performance tonight. David shook the man's hand, still confused by the positive response. Thank you, Mr. Chen, though I'm not sure my performance deserves such kind words. Thomas smiled knowingly. Young man, I've been attending concerts for over 60 years. I've heard some of the greatest pianists in the world perform that very piece. But tonight, for the first time, I felt like I truly understood what Chopin was trying to say. David's eyes widened. I don't understand. My technique was flawed. I made several mistakes. Technique is just the language, Thomas replied. Tonight you finally had something to say. That young woman who performed before. You, Isabella, she's my granddaughter. She taught me long ago that music isn't about playing the right notes. It's about sharing your heart. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. Isabella was this man's granddaughter. Suddenly, he understood why her playing had been so extraordinary. She had grown up in a family that understood music as communication, not competition. Your granddaughter is incredibly talented, David said softly. Her performance tonight, it changed everything for me, Thomas nodded thoughtfully. Isabella has faced many challenges in her life. When she lost her sight at 12, we thought her musical dreams might be over. But she taught us that sometimes we need to lose something to truly find what we're looking for. After Thomas left, more people came to speak with David. There was a middle-aged woman who told him that his performance had reminded her of her late husband's love for classical music. A young man shared how the emotional honesty in David's playing had helped him understand his own struggles with self-doubt. Each conversation was a revelation. These people hadn't come to praise his technical skill or his reputation. They had come because his music had touched something real inside them. For the first time in his career, David had created genuine human connections through his art. The last person to visit was Isabella herself. She entered the dressing room with the same quiet confidence she had shown all evening, guided by a volunteer who quietly withdrew after ensuring she was comfortably seated. Mr. Rodriguez, she said, her voice carrying the same warmth he had noticed earlier, I wanted to personally thank you for your performance tonight. David felt his cheeks burn with embarrassment. Please call me David, and I should be thanking you. Your performance of the Chopin was... It was everything I never knew music could be, Isabella smiled gently. Music isn't a competition, David. Tonight you discovered something that many professional musicians never find. You found your own voice. But I made so many mistakes, David protested. My technique fell apart completely. Technique serves the music, not the other way around, Isabella said. Tonight your mistakes made you human, and that humanity is what made your performance so powerful. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment before Isabella continued. I heard you play many times before tonight, you know. I have recordings of your concerts. You're incredibly skilled, but tonight was the first time I heard David Rodriguez the person, not just David Rodriguez the pianist. I don't know how to go back to performing the way I used to, David admitted. After tonight, everything feels different. Good, Isabella said with a smile. The best artists are always growing, always learning. The moment we think we have nothing left to discover is the moment we stop being artists and become just performers. She stood to leave, then paused at the door. David, would you like to have coffee sometime? I think there's a lot we could learn from each other. For the first time all evening, David smiled genuinely. I would like that very much. After Isabella left, David sat alone in his dressing room, processing everything that had happened. The performer who had walked into this theater earlier that evening had been confident in his superiority. The person sitting here now was humbled, confused, but somehow more alive than he had felt in years. He looked at his hands, the same hands that had executed countless perfect performances. Tonight they had trembled and made mistakes, but they had also created something real. Something that had touched people's hearts instead of just impressing their minds. David Rodriguez was beginning to understand that his journey as a musician was just beginning. 3 days later, David found himself sitting in a small cafe in the old part of the city, nervously adjusting his coffee cup for the third time. He had arrived 15 minutes early, something he never did for business meetings. But this wasn't a business meeting. This was something entirely new for him, a conversation with someone who saw music the way he was beginning to understand it should be seen. The cafe was nothing like the expensive restaurants where he usually met with concert promoters and music critics. It was cozy and unpretentious, with mismatched chairs and the gentle hum of everyday conversation. Local artwork hung on the walls, and soft jazz played in the background. David realized he had never spent time in places like this, always preferring establishments that matched his elevated status. When Isabella arrived, guided by her grandfather Thomas, David stood up so quickly he nearly knocked over his chair. She was dressed simply in jeans and a soft blue sweater, her hair pulled back in a casual ponytail. Without the formal setting of the concert hall, she looked even younger, more approachable. David, she said warmly, as Thomas helped her find her seat. Thank you for meeting me here. This is one of my favorite places in the city. Thomas squeezed his granddaughter's shoulder gently. I'll leave you two to talk. Isabella, I'll be back in 2 hours to walk you home. After Thomas left, David and Isabella sat in slightly awkward silence for a moment. David had spent years making small talk with wealthy patrons and music industry professionals, but he had no idea how to have a genuine conversation with someone who had just turned his entire world upside down. I have to ask, David finally said, how long have you been playing piano? Isabella smiled as she felt around the table to locate her coffee cup. Since I was 4. My grandfather started teaching me right after my parents died in that car accident. Music became my way of staying connected to them and to the world. David felt a chill run down his spine. He had assumed she was born blind, but learning that she had lost both her sight and her parents in the same accident made her strength even more remarkable. I'm so sorry, he said softly. I had no idea. It's all right, Isabella replied. That was a long time ago. My grandfather took me in, and music became our language for talking about things that were too difficult to say with words. She took a sip of her coffee and continued. For the first year after the accident, I was angry at everything. I couldn't understand why this had happened to our family. But Grandpa never tried to make me feel better with empty words. Instead, he would sit with me at the piano and let me pound out my anger on the keys. David listened intently, realizing he was learning more about the emotional power of music in this conversation than he had in all his years of formal training. At first, I played terribly, Isabella laughed. I was so angry that I just wanted to make noise. But gradually, I started to hear that even angry music could be beautiful if it was honest. That's when I began to understand that technique without emotion is just noise, but emotion without any control is just chaos. How did you learn to balance them? David asked, genuinely curious. Practice, but not the kind you probably think of, Isabella said. I didn't just practice scales and exercises. I practiced feeling things and then finding ways to express those feelings through music. I would sit at the piano and try to play what a sunny morning felt like, or what it sounded like when my grandfather laughed, or how it felt to miss my parents. David had never approached practice this way. His training had been entirely focused on technical perfection, on executing difficult passages flawlessly and building the physical skills needed for professional performance. "I've been thinking about your performance the other night," Isabella said, changing the subject. "You seemed surprised by how people responded to it." David nodded, then realized she couldn't see the gesture. "Yes, I was completely confused. In my mind, I had failed. I made mistakes, my technique fell apart. Everything I've been trained to avoid happened on that stage." "But that's exactly why it was so beautiful," Isabella said with conviction. "For the first time, you weren't hiding behind your technique. You were letting people see who you really are." "I don't understand what you mean," Isabella leaned forward slightly. "David, I've heard recordings of your performances. You're incredibly skilled, but your playing always felt like you were building a wall between yourself and the audience." That night, the wall came down. David thought about this for a long moment. He had always believed that professional distance was important, that showing vulnerability would somehow diminish his authority as a performer. "I was taught that perfection was the goal," he said finally. "That any mistake would ruin the entire performance." "Perfection is overrated," Isabella said with a gentle laugh. "I make mistakes all the time when I play. But I've learned that how you handle the mistakes is what matters. If you try to hide them, they become bigger problems. If you acknowledge them and keep playing with honesty, they become part of the story you're telling." Over the next hour, Isabella shared more of her approach to music. She talked about how losing her sight had actually helped her hear music more clearly, how she had learned to use her other senses to understand the emotions behind different composers' works. She described practicing not just finger exercises, but exercises in empathy, trying to understand what Mozart was feeling when he wrote a particular passage, or what story Chopin was trying to tell. "Music is a conversation," she explained. The composer starts the conversation with their written notes. Then you, as the performer, add your own understanding and experience to continue that conversation. Finally, the audience receives the music and completes the conversation with their own emotional response. David had never thought of performance this way. He had always seen it as a one-way demonstration of his skills to a passive audience. "I think I've been having the wrong conversation my entire career," he admitted. Isabella reached across the table and briefly touched his hand. "It's never too late to start a new conversation. The beautiful thing about music is that it's always ready to teach us something new about ourselves." As their time together drew to a close, Isabella made an unexpected offer. "David, would you like to come to my practice sessions sometimes? Not to perform or compete, just to explore music in a different way?" David felt a spark of excitement that he hadn't experienced since he was a child first learning to play. "I would love that. But what could you possibly learn from me? Are you kidding?" Isabella laughed. "You have technical skills that I can only dream of. But more importantly, you're just beginning to discover how to use those skills to say something meaningful. I think we could learn a lot from each other." When Thomas returned to walk Isabella home, David felt reluctant to end the conversation. For the first time in years, he had talked about music not as a career or a competition, but as a living, breathing form of human expression. Walking home through the city streets, David looked around with new eyes. He noticed the rhythm of footsteps on sidewalks, the melody of conversation flowing from open cafe doors, the harmony of urban life that he had never paid attention to before. Everything was beginning to sound like music. And for the first time in his life, David Rodriguez was ready to listen. 2 weeks after their coffee meeting, David found himself standing outside a community music center in a part of the city he had never visited before. The building was old but well-maintained, with large windows that let in streams of afternoon sunlight. Through the glass, he could see people of all ages coming and going, children carrying violin cases, elderly people with sheet music tucked under their arms, teenagers laughing as they headed to practice rooms. This was so different from the prestigious conservatories and concert halls where David usually spent his time. There were no marble floors or crystal chandeliers here. Instead, the walls were covered with colorful posters advertising community concerts, music lessons, and fundraising events. The atmosphere felt warm and welcoming rather than intimidating. An exclusive. David checked his watch nervously. Isabella had invited him to observe one of her teaching sessions, followed by her own practice time. He wasn't sure what to expect, but something about this place already felt different from anywhere he had been before. Inside, he was greeted by a receptionist who directed him to a practice room on the second floor. As he climbed the stairs, David could hear music coming from various rooms, a young violinist working through scales, someone practicing jazz piano, a small chamber group rehearsing together. The sounds overlapped and mixed in a way that should have been chaotic, but somehow felt harmonious. He found the right room and knocked gently on the door. Isabella's voice called for him to come in, and he entered to find her sitting at an upright piano with a young boy who couldn't have been more than 8 years old. "David, perfect timing," Isabella said with a warm smile. "I'd like you to meet Alex. He's been learning piano for 6 months now." Alex looked up at David with curious eyes. "Are you a piano teacher too?" "Not exactly," David said, unsure how to explain his presence. "I'm here to learn from Isabella." The boy's eyes widened. "Grown-ups can still learn piano?" Isabella laughed. "Everyone can always learn something new about music, Alex. Even the most famous pianists in the world are still learning." As David watched Isabella work with Alex, he was amazed by her teaching approach. She wasn't focused on perfect technique or flawless execution. Instead, she encouraged Alex to think about what the music meant to him, what stories the notes might be telling, what emotions they might be expressing. "Let's try this piece again," Isabella said to Alex. "But this time, imagine you're telling me about your favorite day ever. What would that sound like?" Alex's face lit up with understanding. When he played the simple melody again, it sounded completely different. The notes were the same, but they carried joy and excitement that hadn't been there before. "That's beautiful, Alex," Isabella said. "Do you hear how much more interesting the music became when you put your feelings into it?" David found himself leaning forward, fascinated by this approach. In all his years of lessons, no teacher had ever asked him what the music meant to him personally. Everything had been about correct fingering, proper posture, and accurate note. Reading after Alex's lesson ended and his mother picked him up, Isabella turned to David. "What did you think?" "I've never seen teaching like that," David admitted. "You weren't worried about whether he played every note perfectly." "Perfect notes don't matter if there's no heart behind them," Isabella said simply. "Alex will develop better technique naturally as he grows, but if I can help him understand that music is a way to share feelings, he'll always have something meaningful to express." Isabella moved to the piano bench and patted the space beside her. "Come sit with me. I want to try something." David sat down, acutely aware of how different this felt from his usual solo practice sessions. Isabella placed her hands on the keys and began playing a simple melody, just a few notes repeated in a gentle pattern. "This is a melody I wrote when I was feeling homesick," she said as she played. "Can you hear the longing in it?" David listened carefully. The melody was incredibly simple, something a beginning student might play. But the way Isabella shaped each note, the subtle timing and dynamics she used, transformed it into something deeply emotional. "Now you try," she said, "but don't copy what I did. Think about a time when you felt homesick and try to play that feeling." David hesitated. He had performed complex concertos in front of thousands of people, but somehow this simple request felt more challenging than anything he had ever attempted. He placed his fingers on the keys and began to play the melody. At first it sounded mechanical and empty, but then he thought about the first time he had left home to attend music school, how he had missed his grandmother's cooking and the sound of her voice calling him for dinner. As the memory became clearer, his playing began to change. The same simple melody started to carry weight and meaning. It wasn't technically impressive, but it was honest. "Beautiful," Isabella said softly. "Do you feel the difference?" David nodded, surprised by how much more connected he felt to the music when he approached it this way. Over the next hour, Isabella introduced David to exercises he had never encountered in his formal training. They practiced playing emotions, first simple ones like happiness and sadness, then more complex feelings like nostalgia, anticipation, and gentle melancholy. Every piece of music is asking you to feel something, Isabella explained as they worked. Your job as a performer isn't just to play the right notes at the right time. It's to understand what the composer was feeling and then share that feeling with your audience. They moved on to improvisation, something David had always avoided. Classical training had taught him that every note should be precisely planned and executed. But Isabella encouraged him to let go of that control, to trust his instincts and let the music guide him. "Don't think about what you're going to play next," she said as they improvised together, their four hands creating a conversation on the piano. "Just listen to what's happening now and respond to it." It was terrifying and exhilarating at the same time. David found himself playing things he had never planned, discovering musical ideas that emerged spontaneously from the interaction between his playing and Isabella's. As the afternoon wore on, David realized that something fundamental was shifting in his understanding of music. For years, he had approached piano as a solo pursuit, something he did alone to demonstrate his individual abilities. But playing with Isabella, he discovered that music could be a shared experience, a way of connecting with another person that went beyond words. "I have a confession to make," David said as they took a break. "I've been playing professionally for years, but I think this is the first time I've actually made music with someone else." Isabella smiled knowingly. Music is always better when it's shared. Even when you're performing alone, you're sharing the experience with your audience. But it took playing with another person for you to really understand that. As the session ended, David felt a sense of loss. He didn't want this feeling of connection and discovery to end. For the first time in his career, practice had felt like play rather than work. "Isabella," he said as they prepared to leave, "would you be willing to meet like this regularly? I feel like I'm learning things about music that I should have discovered years ago. I was hoping you'd ask," she replied with a grin. "I think we're both going to learn a lot from each other." Walking home that evening, David's mind was buzzing with new possibilities. He had spent his entire career trying to perfect his individual skills, but today he had discovered something even more valuable: the joy of musical collaboration and the power of vulnerability in performance. For the first time in years, David Rodriguez was excited about practicing, not because he wanted to impress anyone, but because he wanted to explore the endless possibilities of human expression through music. 6 months later, David stood backstage at the same historic theater where his life had changed forever. But this time, everything was different. Instead of the expensive designer suit he used to wear, he was dressed simply in a dark blue shirt and black pants. Instead of the cold confidence he once carried, he felt a warm nervousness that came from genuine excitement rather than arrogance. Tonight wasn't about proving his superiority to anyone. Tonight was about sharing something real with people who had taught him what music could truly be. The charity event had become an annual tradition that David now looked forward to all year. Over the past 6 months, he had become a regular volunteer at the Community Music Center, teaching alongside Isabella and learning from students who approached music with pure joy rather than competitive ambition. His manager, Robert, had been confused at first by David's dramatic change in direction. "You're turning down concert opportunities to teach children?" Robert had asked during one of their meetings. "I'm not turning down anything," David had replied. "I'm finally learning what I want to say through my music. The concerts will mean more now because I'll have something real to share." And he had been right. The concerts David had performed over the past few months had received the best reviews of his career. Critics noted a new emotional depth in his playing, a vulnerability and authenticity that made his technical skills even more impressive, because they served a deeper purpose. But tonight wasn't about critics or reviews. Tonight was about the community. That had taught him to see music as a bridge between hearts rather than a competition between egos. David peeked out from the wings and saw the familiar faces in the audience. There was young Alex, now 9 years old and progressing beautifully in his piano studies. Alex's mother sat beside him, the woman who had thanked David for helping her son discover that music could be fun rather than stressful. In the third row sat Mrs. Patterson, an elderly woman who had started taking piano lessons at 75 because David had convinced her it was never too late to learn. She had been nervous about playing in front of others, but David had taught her Isabella's lesson about emotions being more important than perfect technique. Thomas Chun sat in his usual front row seat, his gentle smile showing the pride he felt in watching both his granddaughter and David grow as musicians and human beings. Beside him, Isabella sat with the same peaceful expression she always wore before performing, her hands folded quietly in her lap. The evening began the same way it had 6 months ago, with community members sharing their musical gifts, but David's perspective on these performances had changed completely. Where he once heard amateur mistakes, he now heard authentic expression. Where he once saw people who didn't belong on stage, he now saw brave individuals sharing their hearts through music. Alex was one of the first to perform, playing a simple piece by Bach with the kind of joy and sincerity that made David's eyes water. The boy's technique wasn't perfect, but his love for the music was so clear that everyone in the theater felt it. Mrs. Patterson followed, playing a gentle folk melody with slightly shaky hands but absolute determination. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. David had learned that this audience understood something that professional music critics often missed. Courage was just as impressive as technical skill. Several other community members performed, each bringing their own story to the stage. A teenager who had discovered music helped him deal with anxiety. A father who had taken up violin to bond with his daughter. A retired teacher who found that learning piano in her golden years had given her a new sense of purpose. Then it was Isabella's turn. As always, she moved to the piano with quiet confidence, settling onto the bench as if she belonged there. David had heard her play dozens of times over the past months, but he never tired of experiencing her unique gift for transforming notes into pure emotion. Tonight, she chose to play Debussy's Clair de Lune, and her interpretation was like moonlight itself, gentle, mysterious, and beautiful. The audience sat in complete silence, transported by her ability to make the piano sing with such tenderness that it felt like a personal conversation with each listener. When Isabella finished, the applause was warm and appreciative, but there was also a quality of reverence in it. People understood they had experienced something special, something that transcended entertainment and touched the realm of art. Finally, it was David's turn. As he walked onto the stage, he felt none of the arrogance that had characterized his previous appearance here. Instead, he felt grateful for the journey that had brought him to this moment, grateful for the people who had taught him what music could really mean. He sat at the piano and looked out at the audience, making eye contact with as many people as possible. These weren't strangers to impress, they were friends to share with. 6 months ago, David said into the microphone, I performed on this stage and thought I was giving you the gift of my musical ability. Tonight, I know that you were the ones giving me a gift, the gift of showing me what music is really for. He began to play, not the complex showpiece he might have chosen in the past, but a simple arrangement he had created of amazing grace. It was a piece that everyone in the audience would recognize, a melody that carried meaning for people regardless of their musical background, but David's arrangement was special. He had woven into it musical quotes from all the pieces he had heard performed by community members over the past months, a phrase from Alex's Bach piece, a melody line from Mrs. Patterson's folk song, rhythmic elements from the jazz improvisation he had learned to love during his sessions with Isabella. As he played, David told the story of his transformation through music. The piece began with the technical complexity that had once defined his playing, but gradually evolved into something warmer and more accessible. He included moments of vulnerability where the music seemed to stumble and then find its way again. Representing his own journey from arrogance to humility, the audience understood immediately what he was doing. They heard their own musical contributions, woven into his performance, saw their own growth reflected in his artistic journey. This wasn't a performance designed to demonstrate David's superiority, it was a musical thank you. letter to the community that had taught him how to truly play. When he reached the final section, David slowed the tempo and simplified the harmony, letting the ancient melody of Amazing Grace speak for itself. In that moment, the concert hall felt like a church, and music felt like prayer. As the last notes faded away, the silence that followed was profound. Then slowly the applause began. But this wasn't the polite appreciation David had received in concert halls around the world. This was the sound of people who had been deeply moved, who had witnessed not just a performance but a testimony of personal growth and gratitude. David stood and bowed, then gestured toward Isabella in the front row. "I want everyone to know that none of this would have been possible without a young woman who taught me that the most important thing about music isn't how perfectly you can play it, but how honestly you can share it." Isabella stood and joined him on stage, and together they took a final bow. As they walked off stage together, David realized that this was what he had been searching for his entire career without knowing it. Not the approval of critics or the admiration of audiences, but the simple joy of using his gifts to connect with other human beings. In the months and years that followed, David continued to perform professionally, but he never forgot the lessons he learned in that community music center. He established a scholarship fund for students who wanted to learn music regardless of their financial situation. He began incorporating community outreach into all his concert tours, always making time to work with local music students and teachers. Most importantly, he never again took the stage without remembering that music's greatest power isn't in impressing people, but in touching their hearts and reminding them of their shared humanity. The pianist who had once mocked a blind girl had learned the most important lesson of his life. Sometimes the people we think have the least to offer are the ones who have the most to teach us about what really matters.